Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. So every season I'm always asked for my top tips for M+, and this season I want to give them to you tailor-made for Season 3. In this video, we're going to learn about some of the biggest things you can do to improve your gameplay as a healer in a Mythic Plus environment, because every season changes just a little bit, especially when there's new dungeons going to be on the table as well. So tip number one, this is a question I always get, is this spec proactive? Is this spec reactive? And then the sort of like popular opinions on those things. But at the end of the day, all good healing in M+ and even in raids is proactive, okay? There's always the popular theories of like this healer's more or less or whichever, but at the end of the day, every single bit of dungeon content has unavoidable damage that you know is going to happen every single time. And you can also start like learning trends as you go through dungeons for which pulls more ad casts are going to be going off or more damage is going to be going off. As you start playing with more similar teams, more similar players, more similar specs, you can kind of learn when people are more likely to kick and when not to kick. And so being able to learn about the damage that's always going to happen when you go through keys and understanding how valuable it is to be pre-casting into those spells. With the case of Disc Priest, a lot of times what I do is I just kind of radiance the entire party, and then I'm just dealing really heavy damage because I know one or two people is going to be taking some hits at the very least, if not the entire group. If like an entire volley cast goes off and it hits everybody all together, it's going to result in more overhealing in a lot of cases, and it might lower your overall healer damage. But it also adds an extra layer of safety to the team so that the second that people drop low, you're instantly going to be able to bring them back up as well. Good example of these for some of the other specs is like Mistweaver spreading and maintaining renewing mist onto your allies constantly, even going so far as to be really aggressive with like your 1 minute celestial so that you're always putting up like quick shields onto people, spreading the enveloping breath onto people, and just having really high output at the ready to like push up a health bar. You know, Paladin is like spreading around glimmers so that whenever you like daybreak, you can consume those glimmers, activate the increased healing, and then just lay down a ton of really heavy holy shocks from the passive talent that synergizes with it. There's so many different ways that you are able to be proactive with your healing, regardless of which healer spec that you're playing. And it's really, really noticeable when healers are not taking advantage of it. Whether it's like going into a trash pack and like dropping barrier or pre-popping Devo before damage actually ends up happening. When you know that there's like a really heavy trash pack incoming and it's difficult for the tank to organize, like bopping a player or cocooning like a melee player who you know has gotten meleeed multiple times in the past by hitting too early or something. Those are all different examples of being very proactive with your gameplay and making sure that your allies are going to be able to stay alive. Because as much fun as it is to deal lots of damage as a healer and only play reactively, DPS players are doing about 5 times as much damage as a healer is, just maxed out focusing on damage. So it's really important that regardless of what they're doing, you're keeping them alive. Next one I would say is being studied up, not only with your spec and, you know, the different builds you have going on, you know, that's kind of table stakes, right? But also learning a bit more about the group composition that you're going to be playing with. Add-ons like Omni CD are fantastic for this. You can always just sort of mouse over and figure out what everybody has access to. But even just being able to go so far as to say like, hey, let's make sure we have mass barrier for this before you pull a difficult boss fight. Being able to make calls for what your expectations are for how people are using cooldowns. You know, if you have a mage, they have a lot of like very interesting cooldowns. They have mirror image for raw damage reduction. They're able to alter time to sort of reset their health. And then they have their mass absorb to apply to people. And those are a little bit different than just having like raw damage reduction. But also if you have like a demon hunter in your group, Darkness is really insane this season because there's a lot of high tick damage that's going out. You might have Sarids jumping all over the place onto your allies, and it might deal a lot of damage, but if you stack everybody up, that's a really powerful defensive that you have on hand, and then your job is that much easier to be able to top off your allies, and the pack usually just goes faster as well. So even at the beginning of a key, just kind of reminding people and saying like, hey, be really aggressive with using darkness. Hey, make sure we have it for this trash pack here. Even communicating with like tanks, I know Prop Pally's really valuable this season. When they're going to sack targets, when they're going to bop, or they can have bop and spell warding in dungeons now too, which is really ridiculous. And so even if you're a priest healer and you're going to be a lot squishier, be like, hey, make sure you're giving me sack on some of these difficult pulls, and sort of setting the expectations in advance, but also studying them in advance for whether it's streams. I am now streaming on YouTube and Twitch at the same time, by the way, if you ever wanted to tune in, but also looking at, a variety of different compositions for if you're a healer, how are tanks playing? How are DPS playing? Because the best DPS or tanks in the world are not just great at dealing damage, they're also masters of how they utilize their defensives on top of it. And especially when you see some of the highest DPS in the world, they especially are masters at their survivability, and it makes a very noticeable difference. So you don't have to sit there and backseat everybody going into a run, but just being able to point out some things in advance of saying, hey, if you could help me out here, this is going to make my life easier, and this is going to make the run smoother, or hey, this is a really good time to be able to utilize it. Those things, in my experience with pugging, have made a really massive difference, because just asking for them to use it in like one area early on, they're like, wow, my health bar didn't move. Let me make sure I use that more. And it's just that sort of reminder basically every single time. Evoker, it's very difficult sometimes to be getting them to be switching things around, like their blistering scales or like their hover, for example, of like, hey, I want to be hovered every time that we have this smash going out in the fights. But really good augmentation evokers who know how to do it and how to do it properly can make all the difference in the world. Remember getting like blistering scales in Neltharion's lair and how much of a difference it made having that extra armor as a priest. So studying up and making sure you're able to call those things to your group in advance always helps. Next up, let's talk about momentum. Whenever you're trying to gain IO, yeah, you want to be the best healer possible, but you also have to make sure that you are in the best position to do so. Let's say that you queue up for a 19 or 20 and you get IO from it, you chest the dungeon, there's no problems whatsoever, and then you look up and they want to do another key that's not score for you. Well, if there's no actual problem with the group and the group was successful, you want to follow and build momentum with this team to be able to continue leveling up your keys, continuing working on your IO. Whenever you're playing the game just like a single player game, you're just kind of queuing up an LFG, do one key, leave, don't say anything to them. It makes it way harder on yourself to progress and to find dedicated teams. I know it's like, oh yeah, networking's important and everything, but specifically being in a position where, hey, let's keep on going, being the catalyst for building that momentum, honestly is on that individual player a lot of times, because 90%, 80% of the people are just going to leave at the end of the key and not say anything. But if one person chirps up and says, hey, let's keep on going, that was really good, let's keep on pushing, let's keep on pushing, let's keep on pushing, it does make a really substantial difference. Even if it's not any score for you, I think it also makes it a lot easier for you to be able to build a good relationship with like your tank or a DPS player. Because whenever I'm trying to like progress higher in keys or build groups, it always is about this like healer and tank relationship. And they have to be able to build synergy together and build that trust together to be able to continue progressing through higher level dungeons. Almost every single group will have like flexible spots for DPS, but really the healer and like tank relationship gets locked in pretty quickly. And so if you're constantly in a position where you're pugging, befriending all of these tanks, be seeing which ones are actually communicating, build that momentum and rapport with them, and it's going to result in some really big IO gains. Next up, as you're learning and improving, just remember to kind of keep it simple. There's a lot of times I've gotten questions about like which damage trinkets people should be running, how much damage somebody should be doing throughout the entire dungeon, how much HPS somebody should be doing, how they want to make sure they min-max stats by a percentage or two to make all this difference. And a lot of times, healing is way more art than it is science, and it's much better for you to keep it simple and focus on your gameplay and focus on how you're reacting and responding to unexpected events, how you are being proactive for the events that you know are going to be happening regardless, much more so than sweating over like your gear, trinket options, things like that. In fact, I'd go so far as to tell people not really to worry about damage trinkets at all. I'm in a position where I've done up to 28s on Tyrannical and Fortified at the time of this video, and I haven't had a single time where I was running a damage trinket. In fact, a lot of the dungeons that we were doing, we would chest with like 3 or 4 minutes to spare in a lot of cases, or we would chest them very nearly, but have a lot of deaths. And so being in a position where you're running healer trinkets and more healing focused builds as well when it comes to your talent builds, it doesn't stop you from dealing good damage. You can always get that out from your playstyle, but it also doesn't trap you in a position where you're only able to deal damage. If you're running certain talents that are stopping you from producing as good of healing, especially on boss fights, then that sort of traps you in a situation where yeah, you're not going to be able to add much damage at all in some of those rough situations. And I think that's really, really noticeable when people are sort of like forcibly min-maxing damage when, you know, you're still progging in keys, you're still progging in dungeons. If you're in a position, I would argue, if you're in like 20s, 22s, even below that as well, and nobody died, there wasn't any crazy, like nobody went AFK, and you just didn't do enough damage throughout the dungeon, that's never going to be the healer's fault at this point. Assuming you have some geared players, that's not the healer's fault. People are more than capable of dealing enough damage at this 470, 480 kind of gear level that a lot of players are getting into who play a lot. You're more than capable of chesting those dungeons, even into higher keys as well, if you're having clean pulls and nobody's dying. Just like tanks, as they learn and get better, shouldn't be doing like massive, insane pulls. You shouldn't also be stressing about doing the greatest amount of damage possible, and that's your area of success. That's archaic thinking really from Shadowlands, where the healer checks were limited to like Sanguine Depths and a boss fight or two in other dungeons. This season, and Dragonflight especially, is so much on surviving one-shots and then responding to unexpected damage events quickly with really high burst output, and just surviving, shutting down mobs, and then letting the DPS kill them off as quickly as you can. So keep it simple. Don't sweat over the healer damage. Focus on that gameplay. And of course, as we're talking about gameplay, keep in mind there's always lots that you're able to learn. For example, did you know that you can subscribe to the YouTube channel right now and get notifications on for whenever we post a video and support the channel? That would be awesome. But also, there's so many different things to learn about WoW as a game as a whole. There is, of course, the craziness of watching different players all over the world and being able to see what builds they're running, what routes groups are running, what trinket setups, what add-ons they're using, how they're predicting damage, weak auras, all of those things. But more than that, keep in mind that there's always something more that you're able to do. I know a lot of times I've seen healers that will go into a run, they'll fail for whatever reason, and then not really take any lessons away from it. They'll say, oh, like they didn't kick and I just died. And it's like, well, okay, that's unfortunate. But even at, 18, 20s, 22s, maybe even 24s, I would say, there's a lot of times where just almost like overhealing and playing safer, you can muscle your way through some situations, even if they're not ideal. There's moments where I've had like abominations getting pulled into the second boss of Everbloom, and we somehow like kept it alive, and we somehow kept it together throughout all this craziness. There's moments where we've had too many casters and I'm able to mind control one of them to stop them from casting onto the group. There's moments where I've broken crowd control and I've instantly realized it, and I ran in and feared and then communicated what I did wrong and asked my teammates to be able to help. There's always those different areas that you can make up for when you make the mistake or somebody else makes the mistake. And then also when you fail, there's always things you can do to sort of zoom out. One of the biggest things I like to do is, of course, record my gameplay that I always have from my streams and kind of look at it back and say, okay, well, here's what I did in the moment. Here's the knowledge that I had in this moment. And maybe I made the right decision, wrong decision, whatever. But what else could I have done about it? I've had times where I got one shot through like Fade and Power Word Shield. And I was like, wow, like that should have saved me. That should have been enough. And it's like, well, okay, it wasn't. What am I going to do about it next time? And I think that's always so important for people to sort of realize is that in dungeons and even in raids as well, there are so many mistakes. There are so many mistakes that people make, that everybody makes. And one of the reasons why the best players in the world are the best players in the world is they're able to respond to those mistakes, learn from them, mitigate them in the future, and then also mitigate them in the moment to make sure that, hey, you might have to do something a little bit extra that you're not used to, but how do we respond and how do we deal with it? And I think those things are always so incredibly important. Whenever I play Priest, sometimes it comes down to fearing extra mobs, mind controlling them, or just being really aggressive with like pain stuffing myself or my allies that are not the tank to make sure that we can survive and we can get through that moment. Sometimes it's weaving between like my damage reduction tools to be able to mitigate incoming damage when I don't have output, or leaning on my output to be able to keep everybody alive and then pooling up defensives for a little bit later on. It's very notable for a lot of different healers. Mistweaver, for example, has some really strong defensives in like diffuse magic and sometimes dampen harm, but other times they can also just blast so much healing to keep everybody alive, and that you wouldn't need the defensive as much because you're just pushing up the health pools quickly. understanding that there's always more to learn and how you want to make sure you're keeping your allies alive and yourself alive, and always looking at what you can be doing after a run, whether it was successful or failing. So those are my top 5 M+ tips. If you have any other questions or some thoughts for some other videos, be sure to let me know in the comments down below. And of course, big thank you to our members on the channel and our patrons who are making all this content possible. If you'd like to join, make sure you check the button on the YouTube page for join or the Patreon in the description down below. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Hope y'all enjoyed it, and I'll catch y'all next time.